crest of the tallest hill I can find. I survey the land flowing out below. The sky is clear, the sun is kind, the trees are green, the prairie yellow.
Berezovsky, and I'm with the library, and we are very happy to present to you tonight the beginning of our 35th year of the poetry series. And we have hope. I feel that we have a very good lineup this year, and before we get to that, I just want to thank Catfish Jones again for his lovely music. That was quite a nice addition to this. And I also want to thank the Salina Arts and Humanities for providing said technology, as well as offering support in many other ways. And Lori Brock with Spark, who's also partnered with us this year and helped find the musicians, and also is hosting the reception afterward. So I just thank you for coming, and I will turn it over to Linda Lewis, who is a Lindsborg poet, who will be introducing our poet.
So I had prepared to thank the Arts and Humanities Council and Spark and Catfish. I think it's wonderful that we're having music with these series because, after all, music and poetry are first cousins, as you all know. At William Jewell College in Liberty, Missouri, the students of Dr. Ruth Williams do course evaluations. So what do you know about those? The students, in evaluating her, have chosen these adjectives for their professor of creative writing, women's lit, and minority lit. Awesome, dedicated, honest. The same modifiers could characterize her poetry, although it has been praised by a more sophisticated critic in more sophisticated terms, like beautifully wrought and full of surprises. Williams grew up the oldest of 3 daughters in Lincoln, Nebraska. I mention the sisters because of the motif of sisterhood, both literal and symbolic, which is important in her work. And I mention Nebraska because the prairie is omnipresent. Nebraska's hypnotic panorama, square-shouldered fields, thug-like weather. Aha, I lived in Nebraska for many years. I know that thug-like weather. As she says herself, the landscape of the plains shaped my aesthetic sense. And one of her poems, she puts it this way: you give yourself up to the horizon. In high school and college, Ruth became absorbed in poetry, reading it and writing it. She was drawn to the poets Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton for the, quote, intensity and unashamedness of their work, and the musicality of their language, particularly that of Plath. As she reads, listen for the musicality of Williams' own poems, together with another of Plath's traits, stunning originality of metaphor. One of my favorite ones from Flatlands is this one, Ruth. We lanced the morning, letting sunset seep across the plains. With a BA from Wheaton and an MFA from Eastern Washington U under her belt, Williams took her PhD in comparative literature and creative writing from the University of Cincinnati. Her poems have appeared in Michigan Quarterly, Pleiades, Third Coast, and others. Her creative nonfiction in Crab Orchard Review, Diagram, and South Loop Review, and her literary criticism in Tulsa Studies in Women's Lit, Journal of Popular Culture, and College Literature. Her first monograph, Conveyance, was inspired by teaching in Seoul, South Korea. And the new book, Flatlands, written as one poet remarked, quote, in the key of Willa Cather. Williams has said that her poetic eye is attracted to weirdness. I suspect that you will discover, in addition to weird, the humanity, droll irony, originality, and vivacity of her poems. Please welcome Ruth Williams.
introduction, and also to the audience and to the sponsors of this wonderful series. I am so excited to be here to kick it off. I haven't ever been out this way. I've driven through Kansas to Colorado, which is what a lot of people say about Nebraska, so don't take that as an insult. And I just so happened to be driving out on the same day that someone is burning their fields, I guess. So I feel really privileged to have seen that, because I don't think I've ever seen that. And I was struck by the fact that there was no one around observing. It seemed like it was both controlled and uncontrolled, so I enjoyed that duality. Speaking of the landscape, this book is very much rooted in the landscape of the plains, and though I know that the Flint Hills are different than the plains, I think that there is something about the emptiness that people see. Whether that's actually what's there is the question. So when I was growing up as a young person, as many young people are, I think when you're outside of the big urban hubs, New York, Chicago, whatever, you think, I grew up in a boring place. I hate this place. I gotta get out of here. There's nothing going on. And then as you get older, you start to look back, and maybe you leave, as I did and as Willa Cather did, and you look back and you think, actually, there is maybe something going on. So I'm going to start with the first poem in Flatlands, and that is something that after I had long left Nebraska, I remembered that I learned in elementary school. So this is called Humboldt Falls. As children, we pirouetted, tipsy ballerinas tripping through wet grass. The great fault beneath, gapped like an inverted lens, hidden beneath square shoulder fields, a fact we forgot by the end of grade school. Nebraska hypnotizes eyes with slow lines, straight highway, blurring into horizon. Lulled in the strand of our history, we were like the Platte River, its mud sluice easy to follow out through the plains. The ready-made disaster, subtle as a shift in the wind, unreadable all around us. I believe that the Humboldt Fault actually goes into Kansas. And I think that's really indicative of the interesting mystery that it turns out it was there all along. There's this giant fault under Nebraska and Kansas and some other states in this region, and if it were to ever to break, that would be incredibly bad. I hope it never does, but I think it goes to show sort of what I've been rediscovering as I get older, which is that looking back does harvest, if you will, to use an agricultural metaphor, seems appropriate. It harvests kind of things that are more interesting than you expected. The second poem is very much like that too. When I was a kid, and I don't know if they do this around these parts, but in Lincoln, where I grew up, which is a city, but of course it's surrounded by many rural communities and farmlands and things like that, and there is a strong history of pioneers in the state, as I'm sure there is in Kansas as well. When you're a kid and you're in elementary school, you go to the one-room schoolhouse as a field trip, as an educational field trip. And in Lincoln, all the kids dress up like pioneers. And my mother, bless her heart, made a full get-up, pioneer dress and bonnet, and we carried little pails with us. And so this is a poem kind of about that experience in retrospect. One-room schoolhouse. We dressed as pioneers, long dresses, bonnets, a pocket slate. Sketching ships across the waves of grass, the lesson chalked our hands. Mimicking geography, we lanced the morning, letting sunset seep across the plains. The windows reflected our own faces back to us. Such looks of desire, we wanted to reap whatever it was the plain dresses could sow in us. So another childhood memory. I'm reading primarily from the first part of my book, which is very much rooted in my childhood, which is what I did not think I would be writing about. So you writers in the room may have discovered this yourself, that sometimes the thing that you don't have any interest in writing about becomes the very thing that you are obsessed with. So that definitely happened to me. When I was a kid, I would go with my mother and my sisters to go pick strawberries at one of those Lou Pick places. And at first I would be really excited. I'd be like, yes, you can eat the strawberries while you pick them. No one stops you, right? Like at the grocery store, if you eat out of the bin, that's no good. But in the rows of strawberries, you can eat as many as you want. So I would just eat them while I picked them. But if you know anything about strawberries, if you eat a lot, they're actually acidic. And your mouth will get all sore and sort of like, get canker sores and such. So this is a little bit about kind of the duality of being able to eat as much as you want, but perhaps paying the price for that. Picking strawberries. One in the bucket, one in my mouth. I ate them with dirt, ate until my throat was raked. My mother told me I inherited a taste for acid, a stinging champagne. The tender skin of my mouth dotted with red pulp, tiny seeds burrowed between teeth, a little hardness to occupy the tongue. I would eat more as we left for home. I would eat as we washed them at the sink, hulled their stems. Those nights I dreamt, I gulped, swallowing into a red hangover. I woke, my mouth open and opening. I'd inherited a taste for air. As I started writing about Nebraska, which actually happened more consciously when I came back to live in this area, I was getting my PhD in Cincinnati, and then I got my job in Liberty, and it was the first time I had lived for quite a long time, since I guess college, close to my home. And I just found myself thinking, I think, more about being from the Midwest or being from the Great Plains. And I discovered this term that is physiography, and I don't even know where I stumbled across it. But as soon as I stumbled across it, it seemed exactly correct for what I was trying to think about, which is the influence of the landscape. So physiography is you've written it down here on a post-it so that I don't mislead you. It's a subfield of geography that studies the physical patterns and processes on Earth. So those patterns and processes that shape the Earth, so things like wind and water and air, whatever, things that kind of create structure to the Earth through force. And I thought, that's kind of like how it is to grow up and to think about the way that the landscape has shaped you. It has shaped you kind of like a stream would shape the gully that it goes through. Even if you're not really aware of that shaping, I think part of this book was trying to figure out, well, what is the shape of that gully? How has my own river kind of gone through the nooks and crannies of the landscape that I grew up on? So this is called physiography. Flatlands, the pat of a hand on your head, a good girl, a slicing edge. Like a scythe through grass, you learn to love the sound of cutting hair. An ingrained lust for a portion, reduced. You flat your body like a white wafer, and you mean it to be religious. Like a frontier church, you give yourself up to horizon. So being put in your place is like a cross on your flat back. This next one has an epigraph from Willa Cather, and like Lyndon mentioned, I read Willa Cather when I was young. She's from Nebraska, and she's written a couple of famous novels, most famously My Antonia, which is a great American work that you might have read if you took an English class in college or high school. And when I read her work, I was struck by how beautiful the prairie was in her description. I was completely taken with it. And then come to find out, I don't know the years, but this is like the late 1800s. This is like early times. Her and her family moved from the East Coast, and when she first moved to Nebraska, she was devastated. I mean, she was a child, and she was just like, this is a horrible place. It was just harsh conditions, nothing out there. And then she went to the University of Nebraska. I think she got her degree and moved to New York, I believe, and lived there or on the East Coast somewhere for really, or elsewhere, the rest of her life, but started writing about the place she'd grown up in Nebraska. Even though she'd hated it so much, it actually resulted in the best, well, I guess I'm biased, but some of the best work. She's written like a trilogy of what's called Plains novels, including the novel that I excerpt here in the epigraph, and it's O Pioneers. It's a great book. I don't know if as many people read O Pioneers as read My Antonia, but O Pioneers features a female protagonist who is running the family farm, And that's a bit of an unusual condition in that time period. And she's sort of struggling, I think, with that responsibility. And one of the reoccurring fantasies she has, or daydreams, is, I think, the fantasy of a fatigued woman who imagines a man coming over the hills in the grass to basically pick her up and carry her along. And she sort of dreams this repeatedly throughout the book. So this epigraph is sort of describing that. And the poem is called Radio Plain. So here's the epigraph. As she lay with her eyes closed, she had again, more vividly than for many years, the old illusion of her girlhood, of being lifted and carried lightly by someone very strong. She knew at last for whom it was she had waited, and where he would carry her. In my 13th year, hanging the laundry, the white sheets were like blousy dresses, and my heartache was a new nostalgia, the plains, the leavening, grasses a long cry, the hair of my later years growing before me. How I spent that summer like Cather, wanting the strong arms of another coming round me, knowing that this too was a foretaste of what it meant to be flattened, to love like the dirt, hard, packed, how fertile then not to know what I would become. People don't really hang their laundry out as much as they used to. It's kind of sad because it smells really good when it dries in the wind, just FYI. My mother grew up in a very kind of hard scrabble family, and so we would hang our laundry up even though we had a dryer. And I actually really liked that chore because you could be by yourself. And I used to have my Walkman cassette clipped to my belt, and I would just be rocking out alone with the, dirty, clean underwear of my family, slapping me in the face. But in some way, it was still a sublime experience. All right, I'm going to read from a few poems from the second section, and if I had to describe it, I suppose I would say it's sort of, after you grow up, you start to meet the complications of semi-adulthood, one of which, of course, is love and relationships. And so this first poem is a little bit about that. It's called Each Touch Leaves an Imprint. His knife plinks the salmon's ribs, organs spread, a girl's coral dress come undone. Overhead, gulls wing against the sky, angled shapes that collapse as they drop. He has a sure grip. The blood sticks in a loam under his nails. For him, love and the hesitation it breeds are a long way off. He tells me to put my hands in the body. The birds' beaks flash orange. He does not yet know how it feels to be taken, held this way. My fingers slip through the silk of entrails, blind tips that nose the belly. Here I feel the bowl and suck of current, there the thrust toward air. I fling the guts, cast as he's shown me. The birds circle, swoop. He laughs as they dip and rise, empty-mouthed. The currents shifted, the girl's long neck turned. In thinking about the influence of flatlands on my sort of aesthetic or my psychology, I started to think, well, the opposite of flat is hills. And I do know a lot of people from Nebraska who moved to Colorado. Seems like people move to Chicago or Colorado when they're from Nebraska. Oh, okay, sure. And so I started to think, when you are growing up in a flat place and you associate it with boredom, perhaps you associate hills with excitement. And I happened to be in Ohio, and I heard a news item about, which is really terrible, but kids out in the countryside hill jumping, which I did not know was a thing. And unfortunately they died. But I thought, oh wow, if that doesn't typify boredom, I don't know what does, because when you're young and you want, release of all your pent-up energy, you go and do dangerous things. And when you're out in the rural countryside, sometimes those dangerous things really are quite dangerous. So this poem is called Unnaturally Attracted to Hills. On the news, I heard some kids were killed hill jumping. The car went off the road, hit a concrete encasement. When I was young, my father drove these hills fast to make our stomachs drop away, cut off the blood to our heads. Now, entertaining myself with myself, I have trouble feeling my own body. There's a spring archness to everything, a bending like a wick burned down into itself. What calls out from the asphalt shimmer? A stand of trees, a thrill, the pavement, the dog lunging. In white fear light, there's a shrill pleasure in the banality of the bite. This one's called Light Posts. Light posts. 60-degree weather, mid-January, porch door open. So I'm swimming in the slow wish of traffic. An old song from before I was born, playing in the other room. A woman's voice, beautifully muffled. Is a trapped thing more alluring caught in the wrong season? I move my hands, cover the light to see what emerges when it springs back. Over the phone, the wind blows in another part of the country, and I hear it translated into something. I can't tell. Is it freeing itself from here or there? There's kind of a counter-narrative in this poem, or this book, I guess, of me kind of in my apartment in Kansas City. So there's no real markers of Kansas City, except that I used to live on Hospital Hill, and I told the workshop earlier, there were hospital helicopters that would fly over my apartment, and they were very close because they were going to land on the helipads just down the block. I no longer live in the area, but there are a couple of poems that reference the sound of helicopters. Otherwise, I don't think you would know necessarily that it's Kansas City. But this is one of those Kansas City poems. When you have one of those days after a winter, we did not get one of these this winter, FYI. It was way too cold, but I think it was maybe 3 winters ago, just a pop-up warm day, and you just open all the windows, and you're like, yes, fresh air. And this is one of those days. Hopefully we're back into that season now. I assume that pioneers and settlers in Kansas also created sod houses or dugouts. Yeah, it was probably a popular move when you couldn't get trees and bricks and whatever. Cement, I don't know if that was around in pioneer days. I don't know my history that well, but I was reading something, and I don't even know where, but when I was a kid and I went to, I think it was Toadstool National Park, you could actually go inside a sod house, and there was a giant sign outside that was like, warning, 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 there might be rattlesnakes inside. They like to hang out in the shade. And I distinctly remember that because it made me scared. But then also I was reading many, many, many years later as an adult that sod houses and dugouts, like you can still see where they might have been in the earth, like there's depressions in the earth. And I can't remember who was studying this, but it seemed fascinating to me that you could still see the marks of something that had completely disintegrated. And it was actually meant to kind of disintegrate. I mean, it was, I guess, the first organic housing, really. Anyway, so this is called dugout, and just thinking about that idea of what it means to see the mark of something that's really long gone. The air is cool in a sod house. Snakes curl in the corners like spades without any earth to dig. In the old days, they let the cow graze on the roof, some slow slipping steps above the bed. A fine sifting of dirt covers the mouth like snake skin, the drying corn rustling like limbs. Over the prairie, you can't see what was, dust to dust, as they say. Those houses now, just comfortable hollows in the earth. I'm going to read a series of newer poems, and I have a few of these in this book, and I'm somewhat of a disorganized poet, even though I'm a very organized person. I don't have really great creative plans, so if you are a good creative planner, I salute you, but I tend to write in a more scattered way, and I wrote 2 or 3 poems in Flatlands that have sisters in the title, and then I just kept writing them. So these are more recent ones, and they've kind of morphed. They're about sisters, but they also feature a grandma figure who's kind of based on my grandmother in Ohio, who's passed away. and also kind of some of the things from that area. And it's not rural in the same way that Nebraska or Kansas is. It's a different kind of rurality. I don't know if I can explain how demographically. I don't really know if I can explain how. But these poems are kind of exploring origins in a different way. I think a little bit less tied to landscape and maybe more tied to the people I come from, and the places that my people come from, I guess. So this first one is called Sisters, We Must Exercise Our Spines to Fit the Staff. And it does have a true seed in it, which is that my grandmother, when she was alive, went to a very small Baptist church. And if you've ever been to a very small Baptist church in a rural community, it's a character study. And there was a man who looked a bit like Elvis, and he was the local kind of singer of repute. And my uncle was making fun of him a little bit during the service. So there is something to that, although I think I end up kind of judging myself more harshly than that man. So, all right, sisters, we must exercise our spines to fit the staff. Grandma said in the old days they'd play music on the back porch, filling old barrels with grapes to make homemade wine, a luxury falling through the notes, a purple wave of forget-me-nots. These days, at the little Baptist church, Grandma's back holds a scoliosis curl as the soloist, a portly man, hunches his mouth uncomfortably close to the mic, too hot to handle his wave of P's and D's. He thinks he's Elvis, Grandma whispers. And yes, he must. With his old-fashioned pompadour, he wishes were black velvet, a paint-by-numbers king singing about Jesus taking us home. Earlier, a young woman sang like a split reed, and as she wheezed, her eyes, fervent whites, curled up. It seemed she'd gone beyond this earth, so we clapped to gently guide her back. But for Baptist Elvis, we'll offer the murmur of our hands, less as a sign of his avocation, and more as invitation for his voice to do less by half. Grandma told us when they opened the barrel weeks later, they found cat fur floating on top, and knew they'd caught some preening thing, a kind of country justice, she said, pulling back what gets too large for its own good. I like the way the dark heaves of the chords I've inherited sit up righteous on the lines of the staff, even when we deserve to be pulled back. I forgot that story about the cat in the wine barrel is also something she told me. And she told it so, without really... My grandma had, some really old school things that I, as a kind of contemporary person, found very strange, which is, a very deep suspicion of cats, which is something I think most contemporary Americans do not have. But I do think perhaps maybe in an earlier time. Anyway, she just thought cats were suspicious and they might try to suffocate you when you're asleep. And so to her, this story was really funny. But I was left with this question, how did the cat get in the barrel? You put the top on the barrel. How was the cat already in there? Unanswered questions that Grandma did not answer. Some mysteries must remain. When I was growing up, my parents took me to church quite a bit, and so this also features church and kind of the influence of religion on how I thought about sex and the body and things like that. It's called Sisters, We Must Hold the Water in Our Mouths. Grandma never went in for the pastor's charge for purity, having loved Grandpa past his philandering. In the pallet factory where they met, the greatest erotic act was when a man removed splinters from a woman's hands, then washed her fingers with a rag, pulled and wrung from a bucket of clean, clear water. A biblical scene among the factory machines. It wasn't until later my sisters and I learned a woman washes herself for a man, not the other way round. His hands on her body, we'd been told, a way of bringing impurities to the surface, like an old-fashioned photographic image, shapes rising slowly as the film lay exposed in the acid bath. The youth pastor warns us to hold fast, hands out a chart upon which we trace our fingers down the increasing heat of body parts, hair, eyes, lips, breasts, something we can't name as anything other than south. Graced by a man's hands, the pastor says, will be marked, traces of impurities scarring the picture. But I choose my loyalties, the tender ministry of a man's hands. After all, Grandma said, you have to spit on it to make it shine. I made up a lot of her sayings, but they're very much like indicative of what she would say, so it is some nonfiction, I suppose. All right. I'm going to read this one, which also has some religious themes. I guess I'm exploring religion somewhat, for better or for worse. It's another origin story for me, and maybe for some of you. And even though I don't particularly practice that religion I grew up in, I feel like it still shapes the way I probably see the world, and I don't think it's a totally bad thing, but I guess I'm exploring it at this point as I get older. So this is called Sisters, We Must Covet Hard. You might have noticed I have these repeating titles, and there's no great magic to that except that it helps me keep writing, and so it's just a tick, and I might need to drop them at some point, but I don't know, titles are hard as a poet, so it's a little trick. Sisters, we must covet hard. I would never steal, but when I coveted an object, I couldn't look away from it. An early lesson in desire. In first grade, I took a small figurine that didn't belong to me. The object pulled in my pocket like an uncomfortable too-short shirt, and I wished immediately to put it back without notice. This was a sinner's remorse I learned in Sunday school, but when we were shown pictures of hell, it wasn't the tormented souls that caught my eye. It was the colors, red, yellow, black. How are you supposed to tell who was wicked? I always weighed my sin by the measure of ash in my own mouth. Sisters, the good book descends like the time I got the wind knocked out of me, a feeling that was black and then red, 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 as I stood stark and star-eyed, knowing how I wanted to cross back over into breath, from death to life, my own Christ. I suppose a sacrilege in my need to possess a thing that wasn't mine. Grandma said, we're all criminals at heart. And I believe she meant the red pump well that wants to fill itself, then empty, then fill, then empty, over and over as an act of faith, overlooking the source of our weakness, our saving grace. I'm going to read one of the sisters' poems that is in the book, and this also is kind of inspired from my Ohio family. My aunt made a quilt, and my mother got it somehow, and then she gave it to me because I asked for it. And it's some kind of paint-by-numbers kit that maybe they sold in the 70s or early 80s. And it's the state birds, and it's a quilt that you could paint. And so now I have a quilt that is painted by my aunt. The thing of it is she did not paint it very well. So you'll see like blurry paint on the edges and but there's something really wonderful about it. I suppose it's my poety mind, but I love the fact that you can clearly tell it's made by a human hand, and a particularly shaky human hand. So this is kind of inspired by that. Sisters, we must receive her gift. On the bed, my aunt's quilt. All the state birds painted square by square, but badly. Colors smeared as if their wings were still flexing. Years ago, the sparrow I caught in the mesh net was like a soft seed. Entrapped, I could run my hands round its body. No, not sleek. The bones were unfeminine, the wings dusty. Still, the delicate heart fluttering underneath felt sensitive. I kept it there longer than I needed. Now that my aunt's gone, I sleep in her state, palms translating the movement of paint into places. I've learned migrations are inherited patterns. A woman walks into them, but the bird sets off on its own gifted trajectory. All right. Moving into the end of the book, and as complicated as life can be, I somehow put together an order that sort of led into some kind of resolution. So this is one of those poems that's getting closer to resolution, and it's informed by something that somebody told me, and we were at some kind of, actually I think it happened in Korea, weirdly enough. We were at like a folk village, one of those touristy folk villages where they have like different cultural things, like someone grinding soybeans to make tofu or something. And they had this like maze that you could walk through, one of those like bush hedge mazes. And I was like, I'm not going to go in there because I don't want to get lost. And someone told me, oh, well, if you ever go in a maze and you need to get out, you just put your hand on the left side and you just walk until you find your way out. And I was like, is that real? I don't know. And I could not immediately Google it for whatever reason, so I still have not yet looked this up because, again, I embrace the mystery. But let's assume that that's true. This poem is informed by that. And it's also informed by when you go back to your hometown and you're driving around and you're like, whoa, they really put in a lot of new stuff out here. Like, I don't even recognize any of this. So this is called Dumbfounded, appropriately. No need for driving rain to wash you. I prefer messes, I consoled myself. There wasn't anything true about that. I only wanted to write like a shirt turned inside out, tags gone cryptic upside down, to create a vague sense of discomfort. A rock in the shoe, a piece of floss stuck between teeth, like driving around the city of your birth, but out where all the new shops went in, a set of cul-de-sacs to destroy you. Like a tonic, a talisman, you repeat, keep your palm on the left-hand side. No matter the maze, that's how you'll find your way out. All right, I'm going to read this poem, Jackalope. You all know what a jackalope is. When I first heard about the jackalope, I almost believed it was real. And maybe you did too, because someone showed it to me on like a postcard, and I was like, I had that moment where I was like, well, that could be plausible. There could be a rabbit with antlers. That could exist. And then quickly realized that no, it does not exist. But it does seem very much like a creature of the prairie, if it could exist. I imagine it tumbling through the grasses, spearing them with its antlers. And then maybe nibbling on a blade or two. I don't know what the jackalope would do. But this poem is informed by my imagination of that jackalope. The prairie demands décollage. In strips, tear the grass away to a light hair. The horns, a shadow branch that oscillates in a mythic drowse. The hair around each bone moves lightly, as if bewitching. Touch it, and now you're outlined, torn into shape. Oh yes, you're being found. All right, I'm going to pause here and ask for any questions, and hopefully you'll have some, so let me give you the list of topics that I have prepared to answer questions on. My own poetry, of course. I am an expert on Ruth Williams' poetry. And anything you want to know about poetry or the process of studying poetry or my own feelings about the role of creative writing in the world, of writers, or the Midwest or the Great Plains. Had an interesting conversation out in Wayne, Nebraska with an old-timer from Wayne who raises cattle on a small farm, and he was like, I'm glad that you said it was the Great Plains and not the Midwest, because it's not the Midwest. So we could chat about that if you'd like to. So, and then I'm going to close with a poem, and because I'm a sucker for a benediction. So if you grew up in church, you know like the loveliness of the benediction. So I'm saving my last poem for the benediction. But I would love to answer any questions you have for me. Okay, way in the back.
So what do you think about the state of creative writing in this area?
In this area, I think it's kind of exciting. Now, I don't know so much about Kansas, but I do know pretty well in Kansas City. And weirdly enough, I think because, again, it sort of goes actually back to something I was talking about with Flatlands, you have this perception that we're in the middle of the country and there must not be that much culture happening, but I actually think that there's quite a lot. So in Kansas City, I happen to be part of a community of women poets, and we get together for brunch frequently, mostly at the direction of Jenny Molberg, who's a poet out at Central Missouri in Lawrenceburg. And it's kind of amazing how many poets there are, like just there, not that far away. I actually think poetry in this area of the world is more robust than we might think. And actually, Tracy Brimhall is coming soon, and she's one of the poets I know from that community, even though she lives in Manhattan. She makes the drive-in for our brunch hangouts. And I think there's more than we think. And that kind of gives me some solace. And I actually think that nationally, poetry is gaining some ground. It used to be that you'd only hear poetry is dead, no one reads poetry. But I think the last data showed that poetry readership is on the rise, especially among young people, which is really exciting. And I don't know if that holds true for this area of the country, but I imagine it probably does. So that to me is really solacing, because usually when you're a poet, you're like, I'm toiling in obscurity. And you might even especially think that if you're in a place that's smaller, or you're in a place that's rural, or you're in a place that's off the coast or whatever. And I don't know how true that is, actually. Yeah. Yeah.
You said in an interview, I don't write happy poetry. Right? And I consider that these poems have a great deal of humor in them. So I'd like you to speak, if you will, to happy poetry versus irony and humor in your work.
Yeah, I think that I feel like, and this is, so I teach a women writers class. It's a gen ed class, and it's actually restricted so that English majors can't take it. And because it's meant to expose, I'm at a private school, so it's a liberal arts college, so our whole philosophy is to expose students outside of their own home disciplines. And one of the comments I've gotten from students is, why do we only read these books that are sad and like everyone's unhappy and struggling? And I said, I finally realized before we even get started, I need to just give them a heads up. Writers tend to write not happy stories. And the reason being is because, one, a not happy story usually is more interesting in some ways, right? It's the mechanism that keeps the plot or the energy going. We're trying to struggle, figure it out. But also, you write usually to try to figure things out for yourself or for the world or something. There's something that's bothering you, right? That's giving you that germ, whether you're expressing it in poetry, creative nonfiction, or fiction. There's this seed of something. And usually that seed is not uncomplicated. Even if it ends up being happy, it's not uncomplicated. So I always have to explain that. But I feel like that probably holds true for myself too. And I'm attracted to what bothers me and what I can't quite put my finger on. But I appreciate that you also see that I have humor and that I have irony, because I try. I actually really admire poets that have humor in their writing. And I can't think of any offhand because I'm under pressure. But I wish that I could be more humorous, but also meaningful. I think that's really hard. Yeah. But I don't think it's bad to write happier, peaceful, calm work. I think that can be deep too. I just don't know if I can do it. I haven't figured it out yet, but I hope to.
Thank you.
I think we'll see with my last poem if you think it's closer to happy. Closer to, that reminds me of that song, Closer to Fine. Is that an Indigo Girls song? Okay, I'm dating myself. This is really fair time up here. All right, if you want to ask me how old I am afterwards, that's fine. Yes?
Poets who write humorous poetry, and that cat was a sort of macabre joke,
True, yes.
are condemned to anthologies of light verse.
Yeah, that's true.
Sometimes, like sermons, when the congregation comes to the door and the preacher hears that he's preached on something that he hadn't really anticipated, I think poems have resonance beyond what we can intend, and I'm wondering whether the Humboldt Fault is one of those. I read with great enthusiasm, great intensity, a biography of Humboldt, von Humboldt, the scientist, the late 18th century, 19th century scientist who was acquainted with Goethe and Thomas Jefferson and with Simon Bolivar and a great host of figures that we remember better than he. And so for me, a member of the congregation at the door, the Humboldt Fault had that resonance. Was that anything that you gave any thought to?
No, I did not. I only thought of the fault itself. But I think that's the wonderful thing about literature, right? It is an ultimate interpretive art, just like visual art and all those things, right? It doesn't necessarily tell you explicitly how to understand it, which often with poetry is why a lot of students, when they come in to study poetry, feel really anxious because they feel like there's a trick being played. Like, shouldn't I know what the exact answer is? Like, is it wrong? Like, if you were a student in class, you might say, is it wrong that I thought of this guy, with this? And it's like, no, it's not wrong. It's part of this thing. Now, are there wrong interpretations? Sure. But I think that's wonderful. I'm going to have to look him up. Do you think he's the scientist who the fault is named after? Because I don't even know that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
He
So
is.
did he discover it then, or is it just like an homage?
He did visit
homage?
North America, but he didn't go that far west. He
Huh.
went to South America, where he did research on the different plants that grow at different altitudes. Was quite an explorer. And then he traveled north, and he did go to Washington, not the state, but Washington, D.C., well before the creation of the state, to visit with the great Thomas Jefferson. He was disappointed in his Jefferson's slaveholding, and then went on back to Europe. He was German, Prussian, to see Goethe again, and so on. I recommend it's titled The Invention of Nature. A biography of Humboldt, but it strikes me that there's, even the hiddenness of the man for whom the fault was named
Yeah,
is a part of the fault.
I think so, yes. It's very interesting. Other questions? Yes.
How does your creative nonfiction relate to your goals?
Creative nonfiction is definitely my secondary genre, which I didn't start exploring until probably graduate school, like a PhD. And I would say in some ways it's similar because I haven't published as widely in creative nonfiction, but I've noticed that I really like crafting certain sentences in my essays. Like I'm really like, ooh, this is a good sentence. And I imagine that's actually a bit of a fault, because if I focus too much on that sentence, and I'm saying something about writing fiction and how I tend to write poet fiction where it's like long on detail and short on plot, because I'm just really enjoying describing, and I hope that my creative nonfiction doesn't suffer from that problem. But I will say that I've been told some of my creative nonfiction is very academic-ish, like I'm really interested in information, and I think there's two sides of my kind of writing brain, where I love like the intuitive, creative energy that just leads you in crazy places, but then I also love like this more scholarly kind of linear thinking. I still think that can be really inventive and creative. So my creative nonfiction tends to be more of a musing of the two, or a merging of the two. But I was just working. Do you all know the online magazine Brevity? That's a great one. I'm teaching creative nonfiction, I use that in that because it's got short essays that are 750 words or less. So if you are curious about creative nonfiction, it's online, it's free, and you could spend hours. So when I assign it to students, they always come back and say, I ended up reading 10 essays before I chose the one that I was going to present on. And I'm like, was that the ulterior motive? I don't know, wasn't it bad that you had to read more? But I'm working on something right now, and I'm like, I really want to get it in there. And I'm trying to think about, I went running and I thought I saw a dead body. Turned out the guy wasn't dead. But it really freaked me out, and me and another man were trying to figure out if he was dead, and it was one of those situations where you're in public and you don't know what the right thing to do is, what the moral thing to do is, and as a woman who runs, I know that there's a vulnerability that I have, and then I'm trying to balance my vulnerability, my physical vulnerability, against my own desire to run, like at the far end of the riverfront path, where I want to run, And so I was trying to muse all that, and my first impulse as a creative nonfiction writer has probably less to do with my poetry, but it was to go directly to what do articles say to women runners? And there's plenty of online articles about don't run alone, or don't run in isolated areas, don't listen to music, all these kinds of tips. And I started integrating that into this story of my confusion, because I felt really obligated to help. And I also felt obligated to run away. And I ended up just kind of being like, I'm sorry, I can't help. Good that you called the police. And I just ran away in some weird, startled way, and felt really bad. So I think that's indicative of where my brain goes. It's like information. I like to put it in there. Creative nonfiction. Yeah. Any other questions? Sure.
Creative nonfiction sounds like an oxymoron. I'd like to know how you define, personally,
Sure.
define creative nonfiction and poetry.
Yeah, sure. Wow, that's interesting. I'll take creative nonfiction first because that feels easier, weirdly. I think people have started using, or they started using the term creative nonfiction to distinguish it from what used to be traditional journalism, which wouldn't have an I in it. But of course, some journalism, I think starting around in the 70s, and then obviously today, some long-form journalism especially, there will be an I, the journalist will be present. That will be part of the convention. So that may not hold as true, but I think that creative nonfiction, that term came to describe a piece of writing that would use the creative elements of poetry, some of the sound techniques or the metaphor, and some of the dialogue and description and structuring of fiction to talk about true things. Now I'm putting that in quotes because if you know anything about creative nonfiction, what is true is different than fact. So whereas in a journalism mode, you are going to be held to account for what you write, right? I'm going to assume there's some fact checkers or there's an editor who's going to expect you not to make up a quote. In creative nonfiction, there's a little more leeway, but there's still that obligation to be true enough.
Well, I mean, Cody said that every word of In Cold Blood was true. Now that's patently
True.
insane.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and I think there are creative nonfiction writers, when I teach it, I tell students it's really on their shoulders to define what they think is ethically true for them, but they should always know that their reader is going to bring that assumption to their work. So there are creative nonfiction writers who will write a memoir and make up a composite character, which is actually in reality 3 different people, but for the sake of their plot or the sake of their structure, they'll condense that person down into one, and they'll say, well, that still represents truth to me. And that's kind of where you get away with the creative elements, I suppose, of creative nonfiction. But I think other people would say that's not true.
Well, yeah, I'm sure you have to be very careful because I've been in this very room with some Western writers, and you know, if they sniff an acronym in a board, they get all bent out of shape. So, you know, I just think that's a fine line.
Oh
I
yes,
see how you-
very much so. And I think some people have certainly crossed it, and there have been different writers. Obviously the classic example, James Frey, A Million Little Pieces, which is kind of a while back now, but it really was like a huge explosion where he went on Oprah. And then people found out, like, oh, you didn't actually have this terrible drug problem, you didn't go to jail as much as you said, your rehab was not as long as you said, and there were all these discrepancies, and it was kind of after the fact that people were like, that's too far into the creative. But then you also have people that talk about David Sedaris, who's wildly popular, and they criticize him for certain liberties he takes. And I don't know as much about that conversation, but I do agree with you, it's a fine line. Poetry, how would I define poetry? I would normally say it has to do with the line and the rhythm and the attention to the texture of language. Like a poet is super focused on that, but there are types of poetry where that is not the case. So it's hard to define what is a poem, but if I had to take a stab at it, that's what I would say. It's a piece of writing that is very much about the texture, and I guess to add a second point, it would be about the condensing or the compression. But again, you could have a really long poem, right, that wouldn't look compressed, it wouldn't be short, but the way that it presents its images, perhaps, or it would feel somehow condensed. This all seems very esoteric now that I say it, but that's my best.
That's good.
Yeah.
Worth my $5.
Okay, good, very good. Perhaps one last question and then I will give my benediction. Yes.
So compressed, do you intend for your poems to just come to really stop?
I was talking about Indians today in the workshop, and I was saying I would like to go to a workshop on Indians by another poet, because I don't really know if I could give you a good sense of why I end where I end. I think it's somewhat intuitive, but I also know that an Indian needs to be conclusive, but it doesn't have to be closed. It doesn't have to be settled. It can be ambiguous or a little bit open or uneasy. I do tend to write shorter poems, though. I tend to be in the more compressed category. I'm not the most compressed, but I'm in that side, and I guess that's just how I like to write. It might also be the influence of early editors that have led me towards that. I like the feeling of language that holds a lot in it, but you kind of have to unpack it a little bit more, which obviously requires more on the reader. And not all readers are into that, right? But I'm really into that, kind of leaving some edges for you to fill in. Yeah. All right, well, thank you so much for your questions. If you have questions I didn't answer, I think there was one hand I didn't get to, so please feel free to talk with me after. I'm happy to talk more. So this is my last poem, and it's called An Entrepreneurial Mindset. And there is perhaps something ironic about the title. It was a phrase I heard from some of my business department colleagues. And I will admit, I got a bit salty because in academia, in the business departments, a few years ago, they discovered the word creativity, and they really embraced it. And it was like, hey, that's our territory, get off our lawn, and yeah. So I heard this phrase, an entrepreneurial mindset, and I kind of scoffed at it, but then I was writing about, I don't know, this poem came out when I put that as the title. I don't think I had a deep intention with it, but I think it comes to a place that is somewhat solacing. So I hope you feel that, and we'll see. All right, an entrepreneurial mindset. From work, the road feels doubly long, or reversed, the house is now, at night, unfamiliar presences tentatively taking shape. Like deer nosing from the woods, the yellow blinks of windows bump, bump, bump to black. On the radio, a woman announces the local blood supply is blinking out. It's been too cold. It's not that we're less generous. We've always wanted to give. All along, you've been repeating the same hesitant movements, just slower. It's the same old road. You're just newer. You're new. Thank you.
Well, Lori from the library and I tossed a coin to see who would issue the invitation on behalf of Spark. And I guess I won because I don't see her rushing up to the microphone. I would like to, in closing, thank all of you for being here and supporting this series, and especially thank you for reading tonight. We enjoyed you immensely. The Spark reception is at the Spark headquarters, oddly enough, and that is 146 South Santa Fe. It's on the west side of the street, about midway through the block. Do I need to say anything more about that? About where it's located? Also, I need to say that there are copies of the book available, and Ruth Williams will be delighted to autograph your copy. So thank you again for being here. Good night, all.